This is Big Podcast.
It's Build a Big Podcast. I'm David Hooper. This is the podcast about growing your podcast audience, making money with your podcast, spreading a message with your podcast, making impact. If growing your podcast is what you want to do, you are in the right place. This episode is the audio version of my weekly newsletter. It is called Big Podcast Insider. It goes out via email every Friday morning, New York City time. Topics I'm covering today: guitar versus podcasting, growing your podcast with a marketing swipe file, podcast emergency. Yeah. What do you do then? We're going to talk about it. Is there an ideal podcast length? And understanding why people don't pay for podcasts. Speaking of podcast emergencies, you know what's really nice about Riverside.fm? The fact that you can have video and actually see what's happening with your guest when it comes to setting up equipment. This is one of the most confusing things for people who record remotely. Riverside's got an app, turns your phone into a camera. You can pull that view up onto your computer, move it around. Hey, here's what the cable is, do this, plug this there. Whatever you need to do behind the scenes. If you need to walk a guest through something, Riverside is going to make that very easy for you. It's used by over 70,000 people and companies. New York Times uses it. Spotify uses it. It records locally on each participant's computer. So once you get those mics hooked up, you're going to sound great. It sounds like you were in the same room with your guest. And if you want to step up the quality of your podcast, it is a great tool to have. Don't take my word for it. You can try it free. Go to riverside.fm. They'll give you a couple hours to check it out. Try it with a guest. Try it with a co-host. See how it works. Check out the app. If you do video, you can do a multi-camera shoot using that app. It's amazing. You're going to love it. Riverside.fm. Try it free for a couple of hours. If you want to stick around, and you're going to want to, here's the code to get 15% off. Big Podcast, BIGPODCAST. That's riverside.fm. The code to get 15% off. Big Podcast, BIGPODCAST. I run these audio editions of the newsletter just like an old school audiobook. When I go to the next story, here's what you're going to hear. Play that sound. Also worth noting, all the links here, the newsletter itself, that's at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. Don't worry about writing it down. I'm going to mention it a few times during this episode. All right, ready? Let's get to it. Guitar versus podcasting. I was talking a couple weeks ago about being in Memphis, going by the music school and going through the practice rooms where I used to practice guitar when I was in college. I've got a degree in music, played guitar for a number of years, not so much anymore. In fact, until last week, I hadn't played for over 20 years. When I walked away, I was playing at a very high level. But right now, today, as of this moment, I'm relearning everything. What I have found, and this is amazing, is that muscle memory, you've got this within you, and I'm confident, while right now I sound pretty mediocre, you can't just pick it up and expect to be where you were. If I were to do a year of daily practice, I think I could be where I was, certainly more confident than I am today. I'm telling you this because I know I've got a lot of listeners of this podcast, a lot of readers of the newsletter. If you have put a pause on your podcast and you are thinking about jumping in, and maybe you've had a few attempts to jump back in, but you're like, it's not that good. And you feel that there's something there, but it's kind of depressing to get behind the mic because you're all mush mouth and blah, blah, blah. It doesn't sound very good. You can make this happen, but you need to start. You need to get through that awkward stage where you're rebuilding those connections between your brain and your mouth. Like I said, muscle memory, that's a real thing. You're there, you're doing it. But I think that's one of the things that confuses podcasters because you know what to do. It's just not happening for you. You might have experienced this even taking a couple weeks off, maybe a month off. You get back to it, man, I was just in here a couple weeks ago, a month ago. Ugh. Feels like I'm starting again. No, you're not starting again. Not from scratch. You're just relearning some things. You're going to get that quickly. You're going to be back to where you were. Here's something else that I have noticed, which I think you'll find helpful to your podcasting. This is so simple that many people neglect it. If you want to be a podcaster, or if you are a podcaster, I do this every day, that you get behind the mic every day doing what I call a sausage factory podcast. And that involves three things. That involves you reading. It could be anything. You could read the newspaper, Yelp reviews, Amazon reviews. I read episode prep. Read whatever it is that you would be likely to read on your podcast. Second thing you're going to do is you're going to improvise. And the way I do that is I'll roll the tape. Maybe I'll tell you about my day. But instead of telling you about the day, I just took the dog for a walk. It was sunny. Go into the details of it. Give me something to work with. Well, I was walking my dog. It was a really nice day. Saw a cute girl. I thought she kind of winked at me, but it turned out it was just a drunk bachelorette. She just checked into an Airbnb. Her friends hadn't showed up yet. She was pre-gaming, already about 6 beers in. Make it up. Make it up. That's improvising. That's thinking on your feet. That's what you want to do. But as far as thinking on your feet, let me give you an even better idea. This is the thing that I do every day. Look up table topics. Do a search for this. Table topics. If you want to throw in a third word, Toastmasters. You know Toastmasters. Speaking club. Random questions will pop up. Read one of those questions. Immediately answer it. Don't think about it. Immediately answer it. Here's the one that popped up for me yesterday. If you had to pick one part of your body that didn't age, which would it be? Your head or below your head? That doesn't sound like much, does it? But think about this. You want your brain to be in good shape. You want your mouth to be in good shape. Your vision, your hearing, all those things are needed for podcasting. It'd be nice to not have that age. But then you got your heart, your lungs, your muscles, your hands, the other things that you need to podcast. Not that simple, right? And that's the point. You can take a basic question like that and go on about it for minutes. Get philosophical about it. Turn that mic on, start talking. Get used to it. Time behind the mic, nobody has to hear it. With that said, it is released to the public because the fact that somebody could hear it, that's going to make you work just a little bit harder. So again, there's 3 things that you need to do daily. You're getting behind the mic and you're reading, you're improvising, you are thinking on your feet. I've got a link to the plan. It is called the Sausage Factory Formula. That's at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. Let me give you one more thing. This is a simple trick that will help you put great episodes together when you're interviewing somebody or when you're doing a narrative. So if you're trying to get back into podcasting, think about this. A focused sentence. Let me go back to the bachelorette story. It's a bachelorette party, 6 women in an Airbnb. Here's your focused sentence if you were going to do a documentary about that. A mini documentary of the weekend that they spent doing the last bash in Nash. Will these women make it to the wedding successfully? Will these women be able to survive Nashville without hurting themselves or other people? Will these women maintain their friendships after a wild weekend in Nashville? Pick one of those. And if this were a podcast, then you would go in, you would interview them. And as you're interviewing them, by thinking of that focused sentence, that's going to reflect the kind of questions you ask. And as you're editing, that's going to reflect your editing. More information about the focused sentence, that's at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. Grow your podcast with this marketing swipe file. If you don't know about swipe files, here's what I mean by that. Swipe file is more or less a database, a file cabinet. And it's got a bunch of ideas of things that you can do for your podcast, for your marketing. Think of it as an old school Pinterest board. I've got a gallery of real world marketing examples from successful companies, and I think you're going to find it helpful in marketing your podcast. If you want the perfect cold email pitches to potential guests, I got you covered. If you want to get more listeners to tell your friends about their podcast, got you covered. You're going to find all of these things in this swipe file and more. There are case studies in there. There are categories that you can filter by. It is a great resource. And speaking of templates, you know my book, 101 Podcast Episode Templates. If you haven't gotten it yet, it's on sale at Amazon today, only 99 cents. The swipe file, the link to the discount book, both of those things are linked at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. Podcast emergency. Now what? Speaking of guitar stuff, what happens if you're in the middle of the show and something goes wrong? I've got a video. You're going to want to watch this. It's a musician, not a podcaster, but you're going to relate to this. It's a big band. It's a band you've heard of. And they've got a big group of musicians on stage. And you've got this guy, all in black, the earpiece, the walkie-talkie. He's on stage trying to fix this guy's equipment as the song is happening. And he's got to be quick because in 60 seconds, there's a guitar solo coming up. Will he be ready? It's scary to watch, especially if you've ever been on stage and seen this happening. You don't want to be that guy. You don't want to be either one of those guys. The guy with the guitar that doesn't work or the tech who's responsible for fixing it. As a podcast host, you need a similar skill, especially if you're doing anything live. Let me take it back to what I said at the beginning of this, the Sausage Factory formula. This is one of the reasons that you want to be able to improvise. What happens when your guest drops out? What happens when something goes wrong in the audience? You've seen this happen at comedy shows, maybe. Somebody drops a glass. Comics, they're ready for that. They're prepared for that. You want to be prepared for similar things that might happen to you and your podcast. This is a great video to watch. It's definitely something for you to think about because these things happen to us all the time. What happens when a guest doesn't show up for an interview? What happens when a guest doesn't deliver and the interview isn't good enough for you to release? What happens when your co-host decides to quit, but you still want to do the podcast? The better you get as a host, the more opportunities you have in podcasting. Definitely check out this video. It's entertaining. It's going to make you appreciate the behind the scenes work, behind the scenes people that go into allowing us to do what we do, but it's also going to make you appreciate the work that you do behind the scenes that nobody acknowledges. I've got it linked at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. Is there an ideal podcast length? There's a saying in copywriting, never too long, only too boring. Gary Halbert, famous copywriter, said that. That is my advice when it comes to podcast episode length. Still, I think this is something you're going to find interesting. This is actual data for optimized lengths of different types of written content. And you're going to find this helpful because it translates into spoken word content as well. Press releases, announcements, news, use cases, demos, informational segments, guides, how-tos. What is the optimal length that you will be able to keep somebody's attention on your material? This is something to consider. Most podcast episodes, especially co-hosted episodes, they go way too long. So these numbers, they're a good benchmark for determining optimal lengths for you to try. Obviously, your results may differ. Test this out, but do think about it. Do think about it when you're putting an episode together. We make this stuff look easy. We get behind the mic, go, 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 go. We're ready. We make it look like we haven't prepared, but we're like that comic when the glass drops. We're ready for that opportunity. We've got the line already worked out. We know what to do. This article, it's linked at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. Why don't people pay for podcasts? It's a good question, and I've got some insights for you. We are in an amazing time when it comes to our ability to access information. For example, thanks to YouTube, I've got guitar lessons. And they're free, and they're exactly what I want to learn. That's amazing. I grew up in Nashville, guitar town, right? A bajillion guitarists here. Still, the kind of stuff that I wanted to learn, which is like R&B, Gap Band, Kool and the Gang, Luther Vandross, that stuff wasn't really available to me. Singer-songwriters, yeah, we got it. Country music, yeah, we got it. But it's not exactly what you want, and you're going to have to pay for it. Podcasting is very similar to what we have on YouTube, isn't it? You've got a niche audience. You've got niche content directly for that niche audience, and most of the time, it is free. Here's the problem for podcasters, though. Free is frustrating. Yeah, it's fun to make a podcast, but it's also a lot of work to do it right. If you've got an audience, sponsorship is possible. That's one of the ways to get money for your podcast. For example, Riverside.fm. Talked about them at the beginning of the episode. They pay every time I mention them. That makes it possible for me to get this podcast to you for free. But what about direct sales of your episodes and other content? Last week, I mentioned Superpass. If you don't know about Superpass, this is a service, $69, one-time fee. You can actually sell your episodes. You can keep 100% of the money because you're selling directly. I've got it linked, newsletter.bigpodcast.com. That is an option. But how much should you charge? $1, $10, $20? I heard a podcaster. This is ridiculous, so don't do this. Admire the pitch, though. The bravado of this guy. He and his buddies would gather around a table and just chat. A couple hours later, this thing's done. He's asking for money. I don't know how he's taking it, Patreon. And he said, you've just been entertained for a couple of hours. What would it cost for you to take out your wife or your girlfriend? Go to a club, have a couple drinks. That's a couple hours. $50, $60. Send us $50 or $60. Woo, no. No, man, you got to get your pricing in order. That's one of the reasons that people get pushback, because people know that when you're sitting around with a bunch of your bros smoking weed and eating Doritos or whatever these guys were doing, there's not as much effort going into that as there is going into a club and keeping that maintained, as there is putting together a major motion picture or a concert. People know that. Still, you can probably do something more than free. And if you're interested in that, I've got some information at newsletter.bigpodcast.com that will help you. Quick follow-up on that. I'm giving you this as an option, but my advice for most podcasters is to keep your podcast free. Put your focus into growing the biggest audience possible. Then you can make money from affiliated products and services or secondary income from sponsorship. Now, maybe if you've got an audience big enough, that secondary income from sponsorship can be your primary income. But for most podcasters, especially if you're in a niche, if you're talking about something very specific, you selling something directly, a related product or a service, that's going to make you more money. If you want help doing this, stay subscribed. I've got something that will walk you through the process that is coming at the first of the year. I'll announce it here. I'll announce it at the newsletter, newsletter.bigpodcast.com. If you haven't already subscribed to the podcast, by the way, that's another thing that you're going to want to do. Get the newsletter at newsletter.bigpodcast.com, but get the audio version, what you're listening to right now, delivered automatically to you. And that is very easy. You go to bigpodcast.com/subscribe. I got 3 buttons for you. Choose one of them depending on how you listen to podcasts. If you're on an iPhone, I've got an iPhone button. If you're on an Android, I've got an Android button for you. I've got an RSS feed. That'll let you get your podcast on any app that you listen to podcasts on. I've also got a QR code. You can scan it on your phone. When you do that, Build a Big Podcast will be instantly delivered to your phone as soon as a new episode is released. So go to bigpodcast.com/subscribe, pick one of those 3 buttons, scan the QR code, get yourself subscribed, and I'll see you on the next episode of Build a Big Podcast.